Chapter 4. Loneliness. "Trust the landline, you backslider!" shouted the captain of the boat in his usual irritated tone of voice. "Yes, Captain," came the response of the man he had addressed. The man quickly moved and began gathering up a stout rope and secured it to the side of the wide vessel that made its way down the murky waters of the river it traveled upon. "Renton! Renton!" shouted the captain, and his first mate came running up from the innards of the vessel. "Here, Captain!" came his mate's response, and the wiry man joined the burly captain at the raised dais where the steering oar was secured. As the man joined the captain on the dais, the captain said, "Renton, take a measure of our supplies. We'll need to know what to restock when we reach Point Napoli." "Aye, sir," came the man's response, and he disappeared down the hole he had entered from. Captain Rickert surveyed the boat and crew that moved about it. He had owned the craft for 6 seasons after the previous captain had died from swamp flu. The previous captain had no male heirs to challenge ownership of the vessel, and by the law of the land, the boat went to the first mate. He had been that first mate, and now employed the craft to move supplies from one port to another along the interlocking rivers that cut through the massive forest of the surrounding lands. "Jones, where are you, you bastard?" he cried out. A large deckhand with ebony skin gently placed down the mop he was using and briskly made his way over to the burly captain. "Captain?" he inquired in a deep baritone voice. The man was several feet taller and much broader than the captain, and the deck creaked when he stepped up onto the dais. The captain swallowed as the large man stepped up to him and had to shield his eyes of the sun as he looked up at the man. "For Riley's sake, man, get out of the sun," the captain said in an irritable tone. The large black man stepped to another side of the platform so that his frame was no longer blocking the sun. "Jones, you are my senior deckhand after Renton, and I need a good man to help with the duties of the boat. Would you be interested in a 1-season trial as second mate?" he asked the large man. Jones looked to the side for a second, then said, "I'll do it for the season and see how it goes." The captain grinned, then said in a sarcastic tone, "That's great news. You've made my day. For your first duty, go tell our newest recruit to clean out the latrines." Jones gave a snap salute to indicate his acknowledgement, then walked away from the captain who was calling out for his timing instrument. The new second mate moved over to the ladder that was used to ascend and descend into the innards of the large craft, and expertly slid down the angled set of stairs to land in the interior of the vessel. He walked past the small row of bunks where 12 men who smelled of body odor slept or lounged until it was time for their shift to begin. Several of the men were playing a game of dice, and the large Jones had to carefully scoot past them to move to the next area. In the process, he bumped the man who was throwing the dice, causing the man to release the devices before he had meant to. "Hey, watch it, you motherfuck!" the man who had thrown the dice cried out. Jones stopped his walk, then turned to the man who had called out to him. He held an unreadable expression on his face as he looked at the other man. "You got a problem with that, Sonny?" asked the man with the dice, and he stood up to square off with the new second mate. The other men in the game looked away at the building confrontation and did not stand up. Jones smiled, then suddenly reached out and grabbed the man by his tunic and pulled him into a savage headbutt. A sickening crack was heard, and the man fell back semi-conscious with a broken nose. Drops of his blood began running down his face to drip onto the floorboards. The large second mate gently laid the semi-conscious man down onto his bunk, then addressed the other men there. "Connor, get a mop and clean up this blood," he said to one of the men as he gestured down to the blood. The man addressed as Connor looked up at the tall man and said, "And why should I?" Jones looked at him for a moment, then said, "Captain made me second mate. Now do it right now or your blood will join his." The large second mate moved off and the man Connor began to grudgingly perform his duty. Several of the other men muttered under their voices as the large man moved away. Jones made his way past the galley where the fat cook was busily chopping vegetables and putting them into a large tureen. The pot hung over a small, tightly controlled fire that vented to the upper deck through a tiny chimney system. Finally, he came to the end of the storage area where he found the new deckhand. The young man was dressed in only his trousers and was in the process of moving through a series of stretches. Jones could see the young man's tightly corded muscles as he went through the stretches and appreciated the sheen of perspiration that spoke of the difficulty of the movements. After several moments, the muscular young man came to a rest, and Jones chose that time to address him. "Hey, new kid, the captain wants you to empty out the latrines," he said in his deep voice. The brawny young man turned around to look at the second mate. He was of average height with long brown hair that was held back from his face with leather bindings. A diamond-shaped birthmark under his left eye was reflected momentarily in the dim light of the storage area. "Yes, sir," the young man said in his own deep voice, and moved to put on his clothing. Jones saw that he had picked up a tunic that was lying across a well-worn travel pack. Attached to the pack was an unusual-looking silver-colored staff weapon. The second mate moved over to get a closer look at the weapon and noticed the young man tense as he approached. Something about the younger man's body language put him off, and he stopped a few feet away. "You might want to keep your shirt off. Latrine duty gets messy," he said, then moved off with a chuckle. The young man known as Jacen watched the large second mate move away. Only when the man had left the storage area did he relax. Taking the man's advice, he secured his tunic and few belongings in a secret area of the storage space, then walked past several men who were cleaning up a game of dice in the direction of the latrines. One man was mopping up blood on the floor and leaned in close to Jacen as he passed by and said, "Nice muscles, lad." Jacen stopped and appraised the man who had leaned in close. He was tall and wiry and smelled like the fish they often caught from the river. He grinned at Jacen to reveal several dark and rotting teeth. Jacen narrowed his eyes, then moved away as the man began to laugh. Several of his mates laughed with him, and Jacen could feel their eyes upon him as he moved over to the latrines. The two latrines were semi-private cabins that had seat boards built into the wall of the vessel's structure. The cabins were separated from view by a dirty curtain. Buckets stood ready underneath the seat boards to catch the filth from above, and one man was just finishing as Jacen approached. It was the fat cook, who was smoking a home-rolled cigarette. The smell following him was atrocious, and Jacen held fingers up to his nose as the man walked by. He got to work and tried not to look at the contents within the buckets as he unlatched them from their stations and grabbed the handles to carry them to the upper deck. The buckets were both nearly full of excrement and urine, and Jacen had to exercise extra caution not to spill any of the mess out of the buckets as he carried them to the upper deck. The large vessel would periodically sway side to side as it traveled on the river, and more than once, Jacen was splashed by the contents within the buckets. He came to the upper deck just in time to hear the first mate shout, "And that's when the girl realized she was still a virgin!" Several deckhands near him guffawed in laughter, and Jacen noticed that only Jones did not. Ignoring the laughter, Jacen set to work taking the buckets of filth and carefully pouring the contents over the side rail of the upper deck and into the river below. "Hey, new fish, when you're done there, mop up your spills," shouted the first mate. Jacen gave the snap salute and found a mop which he used to clean up the spills he had caused while moving the buckets. The first mate continued regaling the other deckhands with bawdy jokes, and after a time, the mopping was done. Jacen grabbed the empty and odoriferous buckets and carefully made his way down below deck to re-secure them. Another deckhand was impatiently waiting for him, and as Jacen strapped one of the buckets back in place, the man uttered, "Finally," and sat down with a violent shut of the curtain. Soon the sounds of the man's bowel movements were clearly heard dropping into the recently evacuated containers. Jacen wiped his brow and was about to begin strapping the other bucket into place when he was suddenly tackled from behind. The bucket he carried went flying out of his hands, and he went down to the floor in a heap of limbs. The man who had tackled him grabbed him around the neck and held a jagged blade beneath his ear. It was Connor, the man who had leered at him. Just then, two of the man's friends each grabbed Jacen by the arm and secured him while the knife was held to his neck. They pulled him back to the storage area, and several men who were lounging in their bunks looked away as the group moved past. "Now we're gonna get a little taste of you, new fish," Connor breathed with lust in his eyes. He handed the knife to one of the other men, who grinned and took over holding it to Jacen's throat. Connor began untying his leggings as the other two men laughed. Just then a large, black-skinned foot appeared between Connor's legs and slammed into his groin. Connor uttered a groan and fell to the deck floor. He tightened up into a ball and was holding his groin and rolling side to side in pain. Jones stepped in and addressed the two men that held Jacen's arms. "Let him go," he said to the man holding the knife. The two men glared defiantly back at the second mate, and the one with the knife said, "Come on, Johnsy. We just want a little playtime. You know how it is." The second mate responded, "I said," and suddenly Jacen cried out and brought his arms together. The two men holding him were roughly slammed together, and both grunted as their bodies impacted the other. The knife clattered to the deck, and Jones swept it up. As the two men were recovering, Jacen screamed like a caged animal and brought up his clenched fists above his head. He violently struck out at each of the men in a combination of movements that were not entirely effective in the small space. Nevertheless, he struck each man in the head, neck, and torso, and even though many of his blows glanced off the walls around them. The men were soon concussed and fell to the ground, but Jacen continued to rain blows down upon their unprotected backs. After a moment, he jumped onto the back of one of the men and grabbed his head in both hands and began beating the man's head against the ground. The blows echoed loudly in the small enclosed space. Jones kicked at Jacen and pushed him off the concussed man. Jacen landed in a heap but jumped to his feet with a snarl. "Stop it!" cried Jones, and the young man ran off past him, breathing hard. Jones watched the young man run toward the ladder and looked down at the beaten men lying on the floor. Connor was still groaning from his injury, and another man was stumbling around in a concussed state. The man whose head had been beaten lay unmoving, and Jones checked him to see that he still breathed. Just then the fat cook walked by and stopped with a stunned expression to look at the men upon the ground. "Get the captain," ordered Jones. The man continued to stare, and Jones stood up to his full height. He clapped his hands together and said, "Hey!" That broke the spell, and the fat cook waddled off quickly. Jones attended to the men, and after a few minutes, the captain and Renton and several others returned with the fat cook. The cook said, "You see, Captain? The bastard beat them all!" Jones stood up and said, "Captain, that's not what happened at all." Just then, the entire vessel lurched, and everyone grabbed at handholds to steady themselves. The captain righted himself, looked at Jones, and shouted, "Everyone up on the deck, now!" They left the groaning and unconscious men there and ran to the small angled ladder that led to the top deck. Jones waited his turn anxiously at the bottom of the ladder as he heard the screams of his companions and the sounds of fighting coming down from the deck above. Finally, after the fat cook had pushed his bulk through the portal, Jones ran up the steps and popped up out of the top deck. The deckhands were all engaged in fighting men who wore the dark clothing of river pirates. Several of the brigands carried daggers and leapt to attack any man that was unarmed. From his position, Jones could see a much smaller craft moored to the side of the boat. The captain bellowed, "Combat readiness! All hands, this is no drill!" and launched himself at the back of one of the attacking pirates. His large bulk slammed into the man and bore him to the deck, where he grabbed the man's head and began slamming it onto the wooden planks in a parody of the fight that had recently happened below. Jones swept up a tie plank and narrowly blocked a dagger swipe from one of the attacking pirates. The boat had begun swaying from side to side as the attack commenced, and Jones did everything in his strength to maintain a foothold in the swaying craft. After several back and forth attacks between he and his attacker, he successfully brought his makeshift weapon across the attacking pirate's skull, and the man fell to the deck where he lay groaning. Jones looked away from his attacker and began carefully moving his way through the other fighting men, lending his strength where he could. At one point in the fight, he noticed the new kid fighting off the attacking pirates bare-handed in a strange series of punches and kicks that were effectively punishing the other men. Jones stared at the young man, who seemed like he was glued to the swaying boat and never lost his footing as the other men clumsily fought against the attackers, often falling due to the lurching vessel. After several minutes of sustained battle, the few remaining pirates withdrew back to their own vessel and pulled away from the much larger craft. Soon, their small craft disappeared around a bend in the river and was lost to sight. Jones turned to assess the damage to the boat and crew and noticed several of his companions were alive but had been badly cut. He quickly tore his shirt into rags, which he used to bind the cuts, and noticed two of his fellows had been gutted, with their blood running all over the deck in large, sticky pools. Jones began calling out for someone to help him with the wounded. The new deckhand, who was still shirtless, came over and began binding some of the wounds. The second mate looked curiously at the strange young man who had no injuries and stood up to find the captain. He found the man's body underneath two of the pirates, who he had taken down with him in a bear hug before he had succumbed to his wounds. He had been stabbed in the torso numerous times, but two dagger blades were sticking out of the pirates' chests in stark rebuttal to their attack. Renton, the first mate, had also been badly stabbed and lay bleeding against the rail of the deck. Jones approached him and knelt in front of the other man, unsure how to proceed. The first mate held his hand against his side, and Jones gently pulled his hand away to see a large puncture wound in his upper chest. A frothy blood began running from the first mate's mouth, and the man began to cough weakly right before he fainted from his injury. After a time, Jones could not detect any life from the man. The new captain of the boat stood up from the dead man and began issuing orders. "Everyone, listen to me. I want every available man to help gather our dead and place their remains in a careful pile at the stern of the boat. Search the pirates and claim anything of value before you throw their carcasses over the side for the fish to deal with. Move it!" he ordered with a clap of his large hands. The remaining men began to move with the sluggish movements that followed a battle, and soon the new captain's orders were carried out. After the pirates had been disposed of, the new captain set every man on guard to watch out for another attack, and made sure each was aptly armed with long daggers. He anointed a new first mate from the remaining crew, a deckhand named Tarcheus, who he had worked with for the last several months. He set the man at the helm of the ship as he moved off to check the conditions of the other wounded. 2 more men had died of their wounds, and Captain Jones ordered their bodies moved to join the other dead at the stern of the boat. He noticed the new kid was helping to move the dead without complaint, and Jones set his mind on more important issues. They did not get attacked again that night, and in the early morning light the new captain addressed the remaining men. The rays of the newly risen sun reflected off the waves of the river that flowed by as their barge continued its voyage down the fast-moving river. The men were tired as they rallied to listen to the captain's speech, as all of them had been up the entire night, tense and on guard for another fight. Finally, after several minutes, the remaining 10 men who were at fighting strength gathered together to listen to their captain. "We lost several good men, including Renton and the captain. As second mate, I claim captainship. We will pull into Point Napoli later this morning and see to our dead. After our supplies are unloaded and I've received our shipment invoice, you'll all receive the pay promised you." Connor limped forward and said in a sarcastic tone, "What's to stop us from throwing you overboard, Captain?" Jones looked back at the other man, and suddenly Tarcheus stepped forward and stood next to Jones, staring back with a hard expression at the other man. "Any fuck who doesn't carry out the captain's orders will have me to deal with," the former deckhand said. That quieted Connor, and after a moment, Jones continued. "Everyone return to your business. Tarcheus, see that everyone is fed, then divide the crew into 2 shifts. Flip a coin to see who gets first lights out," the captain said. Tarcheus gave the snap salute and began issuing orders to the men, who broke up and went about their business. The captain found Jacen mopping up the deck and approached him. "That was some fine fighting I saw when the pirates attacked us. I'd love to have you stay on with us, but after what you did to the other men who were holding you, I'd feel better if you left our company at Point Napoli," he said to Jacen. Jacen paused in his work and looked at the captain. He said nothing, but Jones caught a glimpse of a sad expression darken the young man's face before it quickly disappeared, and he nodded. The young man went back to his work, and Jones felt a moment of sympathy for the stranger. But deckhands came and went, and he shrugged as he moved away. He needed men under him that he could be counted on to keep their heads and not lose control. And although the young man was a superb hand-to-hand combatant, he did not fit that requirement in the least. Later that morning, the barge pulled in and moored to the small pier at the river village known as Point Napoli. After he helped unload the dead bodies and the supplies they had transported, Jacen received his pay from Captain Jones and shrugged into the bindings of his travel pack. He walked away from the barge and remaining crew without a backward glance and moved toward the large adjoining village that had grown up on the edge of the great river. The village was connected to a main road that led into the deep forest. Jacen looked around at the many sights as he walked through the center of the small townlet and followed the main path. Covered carts laden with local fruits and vegetables were found on one side of the main road, and a large crowd walked through the shanty town of tents. Many were open grilling fish caught from the river and local game from the forest. Jacen's stomach rumbled at the delicious smells wafting through the air, and he pulled out his small wallet pouch. He carefully opened the leather container and selected several coins before hastily putting the pouch deep within the folds of his travel cloak. He did not intend to be unnaturally wary, but had run into many sorts in his lonely travels since he had left the farm of his youth a year ago. Jacen approached a merchant and pointed at a slab of steak. He paid the man some of his coin and was given the large chunk of the roasted meat. Sitting on a nearby rocky outcropping, Jacen dug into the meal with relish as he had not had steak for a while. After finishing the meal, he stood up and continued his walk along the path through the village. A short time into the walk, he came upon a natural spring where several people were filling water casks and watering their animals. Jacen gratefully knelt to the water and drank several mouthfuls and cleaned off his face. The meal and cleansing had renewed him, and he set off along the road into the outskirts of the small village. As he walked, he passed by several people who would quiet their talk when he approached. He gave many the standard bow of greeting as they passed, who some hesitantly returned while others ignored entirely. The final small building in the town was a merchant store, and Jacen walked in to look through the wares for his upcoming travel through the forest. There were several other shoppers in the small store, and Jacen walked over to look at the travel gear available for sale. A blind girl of about 18 summers sat by the pay counter of the store and called out well wishes to those who passed her. As Jacen walked to the area where she stood, the girl noticed his presence and called out to him.
"Hallowed be the day, fine sir. Do let us know how we can help you," she said in a pleasant and soothing tone of voice.
Jacen was awash with pleasure after his recent ordeals on the barge and long travels alone. Thank you kindly, missus," he nervously responded in the fashion of her speech. The girl smiled at him and was beautiful to behold. Her eyes stared sightlessly before her, yet she addressed her head in his direction as she spoke again.
"Well, I hope this day finds you well, praise Rileyus,"
she said again in her kindly tone. Jacen had not heard that type of praise before and was nonplussed. Finally, he said in a return, "Thank you, ma'am, and as such to you." The girl smiled and turned away to continue her merry calls to those that passed by. Jacen was overwhelmed by the uncommon friendly interaction and turned to the corner of the store to pinch the bridge of his eyes. He felt the need to be included and embraced very badly. After a short time, he recovered himself and selected a fire scraper and several lengths of stout twine, along with a weatherproofed outdoor blanket. He took the wares to the storefront where a trader awaited. The man was older and looked at Jacen with mild tension. "That will be 5 silvers, the trader said. Jacen counted out the money from his diminishing wallet and handed the coin to the proprietor. The man took the money, then turned his back abruptly. Jacen stared incredulously at the man, then casually glanced around the small store. Other merchants and customers were staring at him with suspicion in their gaze. He had been here 100 times before and knew it was time to press on before trouble started. Jacen gathered his items and began to move toward the exit of the mercantile. As he walked, he thought back to the many tavern brawls he had been drawn into, almost as if it was out of his control. Someone would touch him or say the wrong thing, and he would attack with such rage that it made him nauseous. He quickly exited the small store. Just as he stepped outside, he noticed Connor and one of the other men he had beaten walking down the path toward him. 2 other large men walked with them, and Connor spotted Jacen and pointed at him. Jacen quickly moved away from the store and shrugged out of his travel gear. He grabbed the staff weapon from its bindings and held it with its fist-size oval head pointed down behind his back. As the men approached him, he summoned his internal will and allowed it to flow through him into the weapon the way he had practiced so many times with his master. The staff weapon began humming in an arcane way, and its vibrational sound emanated with a light buzzing noise. Connor and the others with him ran up to surround Jacen, and many townsfolk moved out of the way as they sensed the oncoming conflict. The wiry deckhand stopped 10 feet from where Jacen stood, pulled out a dagger and shouted, "Let's see how you like it this time, fish!" Jacen stood stock still with his side facing the oncoming men. All of them were pumping their fists into their hands and loosening their necks. It became momentarily quiet as they all considered each other. Out of the blue, one of the strong-looking men bellowed and rushed right at Jacen. The young man stepped out of the way of the charging man and struck his staff at him as he ran past. The staff let out an electrical-sounding hiss as it struck the man's rear, and the man was pushed down where he slid to a stop in a puddle of mud. He arose to his knees and began to shake the mud out of his face just as 2 others ran in to attack. One of them carried a dagger, and Jacen leapt up and brought the staff in an arcing motion that impacted the man's hand that carried the weapon. The weapon buzzed ominously as it struck the man's appendage, and the weapon shattered the bones to a pulp. The man screamed and dropped to the ground, holding his injured limb to his body. Without stopping, Jacen swung the weapon in a quick arc around him and caught the other attacker on the flank. The weapon hissed as it struck the man, and he was flung from his feet to land in an awkward pile some feet away. Connor watched the scene play out and began running away. Jacen saw his running form, and one of the whispering voices selected that moment to slither into his mind. Kill him. He gripped the staff in his hand, resisting the urge to hurl the weapon at the fleeing form, and held out for as long as he could. Finally, he gave in to the urge at the last moment. Using one of the throwing techniques of his master, he launched the vibrating weapon at the running man. The pointed end of the weapon vibrated through the air and perfectly skewered Connor through his left hamstring. The man cried out in pain and stumbled to a heap on the ground, grabbing at the weapon that stuck out of his leg. The first attacker had risen to his feet and roared as he came at Jacen, punching and boxing his way until he was toe-to-toe. Jacen repeatedly twisted and turned in a defensive crouch, often slapping the punches away from his face or taking the brunt of a blow on his torso. Summoning up as much air as he could, Jacen timed an attack and let out a great battle cry as he struck the other man in the solar plexus. The blow was effectively positioned, and the man slid back from the force of the impact. He fell to the ground, struggling to breathe, and Jacen brought his foot crashing down upon the man's head, causing the man to fall into unconsciousness. The other two attackers were no longer game and weakly ran from the clearing. Jacen approached Connor and pulled the staff out of his leg. The man cried out in fresh pain and glared back at the young man. Jacen looked down at the pitiful man with rotten teeth and gripped his staff hard in both hands. The other man's blood ran over his fingers as he did so, and he lifted the staff for another attack. Just then, he noticed the blind girl standing in the doorway of the mercantile and saw several others staring at him in horror. He slowly unclenched his fingers, then bent down and ripped the man's tunic away from him, which he used to staunch the flow of blood from the wound in his leg. Jacen tied the pieces of fabric tightly together, then grabbed his personal items and quickly walked away from the scene. As soon as he walked several miles away from the small village, he spotted a fresh spring and knelt to the water to wash Connor's blood away from his hands and from his staff weapon. The congealed blood began to wash off, and the clear spring became opaque as the blood settled within the lower depths of the waterhold. Jacen's hands were shaking, and he let out a small sob. Tears began flowing from his face, and he bent his crying form to the water. Just then, he heard her. It was Vel, calling out to him.
Dear boy, my sweet, sweet boy, what aches your heart, song? She asked in her seductive voice. Jacen looked up from where he knelt and looked at the reflection of the water. The reflection of the moon high in the day sky was upon the water, and then she was there, in the reflection looking back at him. As always, she appeared as if to be the same age as he, and was perfectly gorgeous. Jacen had started seeing her in pools of water 4 years ago whenever the moonlight touched the surface of the water. He was always captivated by her seductive beauty, and they had started visiting every month since he had first heard her voice so clearly at the pool near the farm. At this visit to him, her face was very close to his at the waterline. My boy, are you still missing the master? She asked him within his mind in a knowing way. Jacen looked back at Vel, and she looked right into his eyes with a sympathetic pout upon her face. He could feel her pressing into him from within his mind and knew she sought to truly comfort him. Oh, Vel, I miss him so much, he cried out and fell to the water's edge where his forehead touched the water where the view of her face was. He began to weep, and she made comforting noises to him. There, my sweet boy. You will find your beloved master one day, she said in a loving telepathic tone. After a time, Jacen recovered and lay upon the ground with his head next to the water where her image awaited. He felt her waiting patiently within his mind, and her presence was greatly comforting. Jacen wondered to himself what he was going to do next and began thinking back to the last conversation he had had with the master. Vel, he asked within his mind. Yes, my boy, came her soft mental response. Will I ever get to see you here? He asked her. It is only a matter of time, my love, came her whispered response. Jacen flushed with pleasure as it was the first time she had ever referred to him in that manner. She felt his pleasure and mentally sighed at him in a soft way.